Hello, I'm Terrelle, welcome to the Escapism channel, and in today's video I'm going to be reviewing Monster Hunter Wilds. Now I want to make it clear from the start that I'm bringing this review to you from the perspective of a relative newcomer to the franchise, and what I mean by that is this isn't my first Monster Hunter game, it's not my first Monster Hunter experience, but it is the first Monster Hunter game that I've played through to completion, and the first one that I've persisted with and kind of learned and understood the mechanics of a lot more. Now back in 2021 I purchased Monster Hunter Rise for the Nintendo Switch. I put probably about 10 hours into that game, but I didn't really stick with it. I kind of bounced off of it and I never played it again. So I don't really count that as having a full Monster Hunter experience, and I know one of the reasons why I did bounce off that game was because I didn't get too accustomed and familiar with the mechanics of the game and all the ins and outs of the game. Whereas with this game, I wanted to really give it that time, really focus on actually learning the mechanics of the game, understanding the gameplay and sticking with it and seeing how I felt. So that's the perspective that this review is being brought to you from. The opening few hours of Monster Hunter Wilds are very story heavy with a lot of cutscenes which break up the flow of the gameplay. Now I found that a little frustrating initially because I just wanted to dive in and get accustomed to learning the gameplay, but as the story developed I became more invested and this became less frustrating. The story itself is nothing exceptional, but it was an enjoyable ride that is well paced and keeps you moving from monster to monster at a steady pace so you can flex your muscles and what you've learned and test out on the monsters that you face. Now the characters in the game are likable, and this was actually quite a surprise to me because I did think that this game may have a very bland story with a very bland cast of characters that would feel generic, but in actual fact I did find them somewhat endearing, and the crew that you form throughout the game, it reminded me a little bit of Final Fantasy. Now the crew is nowhere near on the level of likability and memorability of a Final Fantasy crew of characters, but it was like halfway there, which is a happy medium based on what I expected and what I was given. Now there is a character in this game called Nata. I'd say he is the main character of the story besides yourself, and I think he is a great character who in few ways is very different from what you see in many games nowadays. And the reason for that is the fact that he's young, passionate, empathetic and naive, but his arc is well developed, and it was satisfying to witness his growth physically and emotionally throughout the story. The revelations within this story were interesting, and by the time it ended it felt like I had experienced a large journey with the characters, and I was looking forward to see what would happen next within the higher rank portion of the game. The climax itself reminded me of The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring, in terms of having a satisfying conclusion whilst leaving me wanting to experience more with these characters, and high rank was set up to be the continuation / sequel to this story. The main story serves as an extended tutorial that lasts throughout the whole of the low rank portion of the game. I found this to be an effective way to shepherd newer players into the Monster Hunter experience so they could learn the gameplay fundamentals. That being said, this game doesn't all the way succeed in teaching players everything. As I said prior, I beat the main story around the 23-hour mark, and that was after doing some side content as well, but even at that point I still didn't have a firm understanding of all the systems within the game, and that's because some of it still isn't explained and some of it is left obscure. Now the gameplay itself is great. The hunts, especially against large monsters, are exhilarating battles that do a great job at making you feel the endurance required for a mortal hunter in this world to confront and defeat a monster. These battles can last beyond 30 minutes, and that whole time I was locked into the heat of the moment, fully engaged with the gameplay and appreciating the game design and the formula that has made Monster Hunter Capcom's biggest franchise to date. One of the reasons these battles feel so immersive is because it feels more dynamic than a traditional boss fight. For example, there's no health bar for the monsters, and I love this because it keeps you on your toes because you never quite know how close you may be to victory. You have to examine the monster to notice the signs that you're gaining the momentum in the hunt. You'll see the monsters get stunned and stagger as they get weaker and start moving slower and sometimes limp, and that's an example of a visual cue to suggest that they've been critically damaged. Also in the bottom left of the screen, when you lock onto the character, you get a heart rate monitor that appears, and obviously once that goes red and starts to get into a critical state, you can see that, which gives you the cue once again that you're gaining the upper hand. Another reason why the fights feel so dynamic is because you can get these unexpected moments, like when another monster will enter the fray and clash with the monster you're hunting, and you're then there trying to navigate between two beasts fighting each other. I found these to be thrill-inducing moments that sometimes left me stood watching in awe. It strongly contributes to the feeling of you existing within the ecosystem of this world. Speaking of the world, this is what I would describe as a semi-open world game. You have a myriad of different locations to explore across different terrains such as desert, plains, forests with a lot of vegetation and icy locations, but they're not all in one big open world map. They're almost in like different hub zones that you travel between. That being said, each individual location is quite big. There's a fair bit of verticality to it as well. But one thing I will say is the world didn't seem as interesting to explore on your own. And what I mean by that is you have a mount called a Sacred in this game. It does seem like Capcom tried to make this game more accessible for newer players through a specific mechanic with this mount in the game. And this is a new feature that I appreciate and I hope more games take on in future, because I think it can be very beneficial to the overall gameplay experience. Now what that mechanic is you can hop on the mount in this game, set a waypoint and put it in autopilot as it takes you to your destination. And what that does is it allows you to do multiple other things within the game and engage in the game in different ways whilst you're on your way to your destination. So there's things like crafting in this game. You have a slingshot, you can collect crafting materials whilst on the back of your mount by just slingshotting them, and having the mount in autopilot is a good way to do that. You can focus on the crafting itself on the back of the mount. You can also focus on inventory management, or you can do things like check the map, see where the monsters are on the map and adapt your plans on the fly while still making progression through the environments. And I think that's a really good idea. You can even just sit back and enjoy the ride and soak up the environments themselves. Now, the one downside that's probably brought on from having this mechanic is that you feel less familiar with the environments themselves because you don't have to actually navigate them yourself. But at the same time, what I found when playing this game is the environments didn't seem that interesting to manually navigate. So when controlling the mount manually and moving through the environments, it wasn't that compelling, and I actually found it to be a bit clunky in areas, especially in certain areas where there's different levels of verticality and you need to run around and find a specific spot for the mount to jump on to move up to the next level. When it's doing it automatically, it knows where to go, and even then it sometimes got a bit confused. But when you're trying to do that manually, trying to find that sweet spot to make it move where you want it to go was a bit clunky, and it didn't work as well and as smooth as I think it should. So I think in some ways, I don't know what came first, whether they put that mount control and autopilot in first and then design the rest of the world in a way to suit that, or whether they designed the world, realized that you can't navigate it that well and decided to put the autopilot in after. Either way, the autopilot function is a welcome addition to the game. The weapons are an important aspect to the Monster Hunter experience, and in Wilds there's 14 of them, and they provide a great variety for different builds and different playstyles, whether you want to prioritize speed with your attacks and the ability to evade, or if you'd rather deal more damage at the cost of your mobility. There's ranged weapons as well, and each weapon has special moves and combos that can be mastered in order to maximize the potential of a weapon during a hunt. This adds an unexpected amount of depth, which I appreciated. It somewhat reminded me of the weapon variety in Bloodborne with the trick weapons. I initially started my playthrough with the charge blade before quickly switching to the dual blades after realizing that that would be a better fit for me whilst trying to learn the game in the early hours. The reason for that is that the charge blade requires a lot of different combinations to truly maximize that weapon and its potential, and I just couldn't wrap my head around that in the early phases whilst trying to learn the rest of the game. So having switched to the dual blades, I found it a much more enjoyable experience. It was much more simpler for me to get used to, but still had the depth along with it, because it wasn't until I was a couple hours in that I started to realize there was a whole lot more I could have been doing with the dual blades to get more out of it. And it was very satisfying kind of overcoming that learning curve and working out that there was a whole lot more damage I could be dealing with this weapon. When it comes to games like this, I tend to gravitate towards the faster paced weapons and the quicker movement. I think that's the Bloodborne in me. I just love to be on the offensive, and I grew up playing games like Devil May Cry, God of War, games with much more quicker attacks. So I tend to gravitate towards those type of weapons. Shortly after the halfway point, I switched to using the longsword because I felt like I grew accustomed to the dual blades and I wanted a fresh challenge. And whilst the longsword is slower to use than the dual blade, it did present quite an interesting dynamic in terms of a weapon for someone like myself, because it had a fast flurry of attacks, but you just had to be more precise with how you committed to the move. And I found it a fascinating weapon to use, and I ended up sticking with that weapon all the way through into the end game. And I really love that weapon, and I had a similar experience to the dual blades where I was using it a certain way, and then shortly after I realized there's a different move set that I can master with it that will actually make it even stronger. And then once I learned that, it became even more fun again, and I really enjoy that weapon. But one aspect of the weapons in this game that I think is really, really good, and all good games like this are the same in the sense that there's a lot of variables to each weapon, which means it will take a lot of time to master each weapon, which actually gives you a lot of replay value in the game. And for a game like this, where you're going to be playing the game for a long time through the end game, it gives you a lot of incentive to do so, because I now know that I can master the longsword, which I have done, master the dual blade, and then I've got a lot of content to play through in the end game where I can master the rest of the 12 weapons at a different pace and get familiar with all of them. And I think the insect glaive is the one that I'm going to go for next. For long range efficiency during my playthrough, I used a heavy bowgun, and being able to carry a secondary weapon into battle, which you can swap by hopping onto your mount, allows you to have a complementary or backup strategy for your hunts. Beyond the story, you have the endgame content, which is where the true Monster Hunter experience begins, as you are released into the wilds to hunt higher ranked monsters. This portion of the game really shines, and the gameplay loop of identifying high rank and tempered monsters to hunt for better rewards becomes addictive and more satisfying than the hunts were in the story campaign. This is where the multiplayer aspects of the game come into play in a more interesting way. You can join other people's quests to hunt together or assist hunters in need. These things are things you can do in the low rank section of the game, but you're better off waiting to do it once you've reached high rank, because it's much more fun and much more rewarding. I can see myself sticking with this game for a long time, especially as more content and events get added over time. Once you've mastered enough of it, it becomes quite an easy option of a game to pick up and play for a hunt or two that won't require too much of your time per play session if you're short on time or balancing it whilst playing another game. Visually, Monster Hunter Wilds looks pretty good in some places, but I was playing it on my PS5 Pro in framerate mode and it didn't impress me all that much. Capcom's Dragon's Dogma 2 runs on the same RE engine, and that game, especially its lighting, looks stunning and feels like a high-end graphical experience, whereas Monster Hunter Wilds doesn't. The biggest visual flaw I experienced were the shockingly low quality textures in many of the locations. This flaw made these environments look well below the standard I'd expect for a mid-gen PS5 game, and these poor textures felt like something out of the early PS4 generation, dare I say late PS3 generation. Another aspect to the game I'd criticize are the controls, which are sometimes unresponsive. This gets frustrating when you're in the heat of battle and you try to use a health potion by using your radial hotkey or the square button, yet nothing happens and you're there hitting the button multiple times waiting for the game to respond. Now, the last thing I want to speak about is the monsters themselves and a particular gameplay element that is key in terms of taking these monsters down. Now, the monsters, the designs of the monsters, and the overall art direction of the game is excellent across the board. I think the variety of monsters, how you can attack them, how they move and their move sets and attacks, I really enjoyed it, especially the big ones and the guardian monsters in this game. I thought they did a terrific job with that across the board. But another aspect of this game that I think helped engage me within the combat of this game more than Monster Hunter Rise is the fact that they have this whole weak point system and focus attacks. Now, what that essentially means is instead of just hitting the attack button and flailing with your weapon and hoping for the best, you can click L2 and focus in and hone in on a specific part of the monster that you want to attack, and if you attack that point enough, a weak point will emerge, which is like a glowing red mark on the enemy. And if you hit R1 from that point, you'll do what's called a focused attack, where they do a special move essentially that is directed all at that one weak point, and you can sever the limbs of the enemy or just critically damage that aspect of the enemy. And that's an aspect of the gameplay loop that is what you're kind of striving for in the middle of these hunts, and I think that helps make the gameplay of hunting these monsters much more engaging on a moment-to-moment basis, because you're kind of trying to target specific limbs and specific weak points, because you can actually garner rewards from doing so and different materials to craft into weapons and armor. So I did like that aspect of the game and that added element to the gameplay. Overall, I have largely enjoyed my experience with Monster Hunter Wilds. I think Capcom have succeeded with creating a game that does a better job at bringing newer players on board and getting them accustomed to the game design and gameplay, although they haven't done a perfect job in that area due to the fact that it still leaves you unaware of how to do some key things. The other key notable flaw is the visuals in terms of the textures, which are very, very poor. But aside from that, the story was engaging enough, the cutscenes had sharp direction, and it's the characters and the monsters themselves which will stick with me. The gameplay loop is addictive, and I intend to continue playing the game through the endgame content for the foreseeable future. This was my first new release purchase of the year, and I'm very happy with it. I'm giving Monster Hunter Wilds 9 out of 10. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. If you enjoyed the video, hit the like button, that'll help me out a lot, and hit the subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a nice day.